Rich CEO gives coat to freezing old lady, then breaks down when he sees her at his mother's grave. Jonathan Blackwell stood at the window of his penthouse apartment, overlooking the bustling city of New York. At 42, he was the epitome of success, CEO of Blackwell Investments, one of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street. His sharp features, expertly tailored suit, and confident demeanor spoke of a man accustomed to power and luxury. But as he gazed at the city below, Jonathan felt a familiar emptiness gnawing at him. For all his wealth and achievements, he was alone. His relentless pursuit of success had cost him his marriage, strained his relationship with his teenage daughter, and left him with little time for genuine connections. Born into a middle-class family in a small town in Connecticut, Jonathan had always been driven. His mother, Elizabeth, a kind-hearted elementary school teacher, had instilled in him the value of hard work and compassion. His father, a struggling small business owner, had inadvertently taught him the importance of financial security. Jonathan's rise in the financial world had been meteoric. He had a talent for numbers and an uncanny ability to predict market trends. By 30, he was already making waves on Wall Street. By 35, he had founded his own company. Now, at 42, he was at the pinnacle of his career, with a net worth that put him squarely in the billionaire category. But success had come at a price. His ex-wife Sarah had left him 3 years ago, tired of competing with his work for attention. His daughter, Emily, now 16, spent most of her time with her mother, her visits to Jonathan's apartment becoming increasingly rare and tense. As the winter sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Jonathan's thoughts drifted to his mother. Elizabeth had passed away 5 years ago, and he still felt her loss keenly. She had been his moral compass, always reminding him of the importance of kindness and giving back. In the years since her death, he had thrown himself even more intensely into his work, as if trying to outrun the grief and the nagging feeling that he was disappointing her somehow. Tomorrow was the anniversary of Elizabeth's passing, and Jonathan had cleared his schedule to visit her grave. It was one of the few times each year he allowed himself to step away from work completely. As he prepared for bed, he felt a mix of anticipation and dread. These visits always left him feeling raw and vulnerable, emotions he wasn't comfortable with in his day-to-day life. Little did Jonathan know that the next 24 hours would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, family, and the legacy his mother had left behind. As he drifted off to sleep, the city lights twinkling below, he was blissfully unaware of the profound change that awaited him. The next morning dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the somber occasion. Jonathan dressed in a somber black suit, forgoing his usual colorful tie for a muted gray one. As he made his way out of his building, he nodded to the doorman, who looked surprised to see him leaving so early. "Taking the day off, Mr. Blackwell?" the doorman asked. Jonathan managed a small smile. "Something like that, George. I'll be back this evening." As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the biting winter wind hit him full force. He pulled his expensive wool coat tighter around him, grateful for its warmth. The streets were relatively quiet, with only a few early morning commuters hurrying along, their heads bowed against the cold. Jonathan was about to hail a cab when something caught his eye. An elderly woman was huddled on a nearby bench, shivering violently. Her thin jacket was clearly no match for the frigid temperature, and her weathered hands clutched a small paper cup, likely empty of the coffee it once held. For a moment, Jonathan hesitated. In his world of high finance and cutthroat deals, it was easy to become desensitized to the struggles of others. But something about the woman's vulnerability struck a chord in him. Perhaps it was the thought of his mother or the significance of the day, but Jonathan found himself walking towards the bench instead of the waiting cabs. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, approaching the woman. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up, her rheumy eyes filled with a mixture of wariness and resignation. "I'm fine, young man," she replied, her voice quavering slightly. "Just waiting for the shelter to open." Jonathan glanced at his watch. It was barely 7 a.m. "The shelter won't open for hours," he said, concern creeping into his voice. "You'll freeze out here." The woman shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass a lifetime of hardships. "Not much choice, is there?" Can't afford a warm place to stay, and the shelters are always full this time of year. Jonathan felt a pang of guilt as he thought of his heated penthouse apartment with its multiple spare rooms that never saw use. Without really thinking about it, he began to shrug off his coat. "Here," he said, draping the warm wool over the woman's shoulders. "Take this. It's too cold to be out here without proper protection." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "Please," Jonathan insisted, already feeling the cold seeping through his suit jacket. "I have others. You need this more than I do right now." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she clutched the coat around her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're very kind. Your mother must be proud of you." The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. If only she knew, he thought bitterly. Aloud, he simply said, "Take care of yourself, ma'am. Stay warm." As he walked away, hailing a cab to take him to the cemetery, Jonathan couldn't shake the image of the woman or her words about his mother. The interaction had stirred something in him, a mix of emotions he couldn't quite identify. The cab ride to the cemetery was quiet, Jonathan lost in thought. He barely noticed the passing scenery, his mind replaying the encounter with the elderly woman and drifting to memories of his mother. Elizabeth had always emphasized the importance of helping others, of using one's resources to make a difference in people's lives. When was the last time he had done something truly selfless? As the cab pulled up to the cemetery gates, Jonathan felt a familiar sense of melancholy wash over him. He paid the driver and stepped out into the cold, immediately missing the warmth of his coat. But as he thought of the elderly woman wrapped in that same coat, he felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. Walking through the quiet paths of the cemetery, Jonathan made his way to his mother's grave. The polished granite headstone came into view, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Elizabeth Blackwell, beloved mother and teacher," it read, the words a stark reminder of the legacy she had left behind. As Jonathan stood there, lost in memories and regrets, he had no idea that his simple act of kindness earlier that morning had set in motion a chain of events that would profoundly change his life. The elderly woman, the coat, and his mother's grave would soon converge in a way he could never have anticipated, challenging everything he thought he knew about success, compassion, and the true meaning of legacy. The next morning, Jonathan woke early, his sleep having been fitful and filled with strange dreams. Images of his mother, the elderly woman, and swirling snow had chased each other through his subconscious, leaving him feeling unsettled and drained. Despite his exhaustion, he felt compelled to visit his mother's grave again. It was unusual for him to go 2 days in a row, but something about yesterday's visit had left him feeling incomplete, as if there was more to be said or done. As he approached the cemetery, the early morning mist was just beginning to lift. The grass was wet with dew, and the air was crisp and clean. Jonathan made his way along the familiar path, his mind still clouded with the remnants of his dreams. But as he neared his mother's grave, he stopped short. There, kneeling in front of the headstone, was a figure that made his heart skip a beat. It was the elderly woman from yesterday, still wrapped in his coat, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. For a moment, Jonathan stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. How could this be? What possible connection could this woman have to his mother's grave? Slowly, he approached, his footsteps muffled by the damp grass. As he drew closer, he could hear the woman's soft words, punctuated by sniffles. "Oh, Lizzie," she was saying, "I miss you so much. You always knew what to do, how to make things right. I wish you were here now." Jonathan's mind reeled. Lizzie? That was what his father had always called his mother. But how did this woman know that? "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman turned, startled, her eyes widening as she recognized him. "Oh, it's you, the kind man from yesterday. I can explain." Jonathan sank to his knees beside her, his eyes fixed on his mother's name on the headstone. "Please," he said, "tell me how you know my mother." The woman's face softened with understanding. "Your mother? Oh, my dear boy, Elizabeth was my best friend for over 50 years. We taught together at Lincoln Elementary. I'm Margaret. Margaret Holbrook." The name hit Jonathan like a thunderbolt. Aunt Maggie, that's what he had called her as a child. Memories came flooding back, summer picnics, Christmas dinners, his mother and Margaret laughing together in the kitchen. But how? Jonathan stammered. I haven't seen you in years. I thought you'd moved away after retirement. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I did move to be closer to my daughter, but life has a way of taking unexpected turns. My Sarah passed away last year, and I found myself alone and struggling. I came back here, hoping to find some connection to happier times, but I never expected. Her voice trailed off as she looked at Jonathan, really looked at him. My God, she whispered, you look so much like your father, but you have Lizzie's eyes. How did I not see it yesterday? Jonathan felt as if the ground was shifting beneath him. This woman, this dear friend of his mother's, had been right in front of him, and he hadn't recognized her. He had given her his coat, yes, but he hadn't truly seen her. As the full impact of the situation hit him, Jonathan felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Shock, grief, guilt, and a strange sense of hope. Here was a living link to his mother, someone who had known and loved her, someone who could perhaps help fill the void her passing had left. Aunt Maggie, he said, his voice choked with emotion, I think we have a lot to talk about. As the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the cemetery, Jonathan realized that this unexpected encounter was more than just a coincidence. It was an opportunity for healing, for connection, and perhaps for rediscovering the parts of himself he had lost along the way. In the days following his surprising encounter with Margaret at his mother's grave, Jonathan found himself at a crossroads. The revelation of Margaret's identity and her connection to his mother had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront aspects of his life and choices that he had long ignored. After their emotional meeting at the cemetery, Jonathan had insisted on taking Margaret to breakfast. Over steaming cups of coffee and plates of eggs and toast, Margaret had shared stories of his mother that Jonathan had never heard before. Tales of their early teaching days, of the challenges they had faced together, and of the unwavering friendship that had sustained them through life's ups and downs. As Margaret spoke, Jonathan felt a mix of emotions: joy at hearing these new facets of his mother's life, and a deep, aching regret for the years he had lost, both with his mother and with the woman he had once called Aunt Maggie. It was during this conversation that Jonathan made a decision that would alter the course of his life. Aunt Maggie, he said, reaching across the table to take her weathered hand in his, I want to help you. Please, let me find you a place to stay, somewhere comfortable and warm. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Jonathan, that's very kind of you, but I couldn't possibly accept such charity. I'll be fine, really. Jonathan shook his head firmly. It's not charity, Aunt Maggie. It's what Mom would have wanted, and it's what I want to do. Please let me do this for you, for her. After some gentle persuasion, Margaret agreed, and so began a whirlwind of activity that would have far-reaching consequences for both Jonathan and those around him. First, Jonathan set about finding suitable accommodation for Margaret. He threw himself into the task with the same intensity he usually reserved for multi-million-dollar deals. Within days, he had secured a comfortable one-bedroom apartment in a senior living community not far from his own home. The process of helping Margaret get settled sparked something in Jonathan. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond the accumulation of wealth and power. He found himself spending more and more time with Margaret, listening to her stories, helping her navigate her new surroundings, and slowly rekindling the connection they had shared in his childhood. However, Jonathan's newfound focus on Margaret and his desire to honor his mother's memory did not come without consequences. His absence from the office and his distraction when he was there began to be noticed. Board members whispered about his commitment to the company. Deals that required his personal touch began to falter. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after he had helped Margaret move into her new apartment, Jonathan's assistant interrupted a visit with an urgent message. The Zhang merger, a deal Jonathan had been working on for months, was on the verge of collapse. The Chinese investors were threatening to pull out, citing concerns about Blackwell Investments' apparent lack of focus. Jonathan found himself torn. The old him would have dropped everything and rushed to the office, working through the night if necessary to salvage the deal. But now, as he looked at Margaret's concerned face, he hesitated. Go, Margaret said softly, understanding in her eyes. "Your work is important too, Jonathan. Don't neglect it on my account." With a heavy heart, Jonathan left Margaret's apartment and headed to the office. He spent the next 48 hours in intense negotiations, barely sleeping or eating. In the end, he managed to save the deal, but at a cost. The terms were less favorable than they would have been, and Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow failed. As he finally left the office, exhausted but successful, Jonathan realized that he needed to find a balance. He couldn't abandon his responsibilities at work, but neither could he return to his old way of life, where nothing mattered but the bottom line. The consequences of his decision to help Margaret continued to ripple through his life. His ex-wife, Sarah, was surprised and somewhat skeptical when he called to reschedule a meeting with their lawyers, explaining that he was helping an old family friend. His daughter, Emily, was initially annoyed when he had to cancel a planned shopping trip, but her curiosity was piqued when he explained about Margaret. "Can I meet her?" Emily asked, a hint of the little girl she had once been in her voice. "I'd like to hear stories about Grandma." Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat. "Of course, sweetheart. I think Aunt Maggie would love to meet you." As the weeks passed, Jonathan found himself navigating a new reality. He was still CEO of Blackwell Investments, still responsible for millions of dollars and hundreds of employees. But he was also a son honoring his mother's memory, a nephew reconnecting with a long-lost aunt, and a father trying to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. The consequences of his decision were far-reaching, and not always easy to manage. There were late nights at the office trying to make up for lost time, awkward explanations to business associates who couldn't understand his new priorities, and moments of doubt when he wondered if he was doing the right thing. But there were also moments of profound joy. Margaret's delight at having Emily over for tea, the look of pride on his daughter's face when he told her about the scholarship fund he was setting up in his mother's name, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was living up to the values his mother had instilled in him. As Jonathan navigated this new chapter in his life, he began to realize that the consequences of his decision to help Margaret weren't just affecting him. His actions were creating ripples that touched the lives of those around him in unexpected ways. His employees, initially concerned about his apparent distraction, began to see a different side of their usually stern and focused CEO. When Jonathan shared the story of Margaret and his mother during a company-wide meeting, explaining his new initiative to offer paid volunteer days for all employees, the response was overwhelmingly positive. The company's morale improved, and with it, productivity. In the boardroom, some of the older members who had known Elizabeth Blackwell spoke up in support of Jonathan's new direction. They shared their own stories of how Elizabeth's kindness had touched their lives, reinforcing the idea that compassion and business success were not mutually exclusive. However, not all the consequences were positive. A few key investors, concerned about what they saw as Jonathan's soft new approach, began to withdraw their support. The company's stock price took a hit, and Jonathan found himself working harder than ever to prove that his new priorities didn't mean a lack of commitment to the company's success. His relationship with Sarah, his ex-wife, also underwent changes. At first, she was skeptical of his apparent transformation, assuming it was some sort of midlife crisis. But as she saw the positive effect it was having on Emily, her attitude began to soften. They found themselves able to communicate more effectively about co-parenting, with less of the tension that had characterized their interactions since the divorce. Perhaps the most significant consequence was the change in Jonathan himself. As he spent more time with Margaret, listening to her stories and helping her reconnect with the world, he found himself rediscovering parts of himself he had long suppressed. His mother's values of compassion, generosity, and community service, which he had pushed aside in his relentless pursuit of success, began to resurface. This internal change manifested in various ways. Jonathan started volunteering at a local soup kitchen on weekends, often bringing Emily along. He initiated a mentoring program at Blackwell Investments, pairing seasoned executives with promising students from underprivileged backgrounds. He even reconnected with old friends from his hometown, people he had lost touch with as he climbed the corporate ladder. But with these positive changes came challenges. Jonathan struggled to balance his new commitments with the demands of his job. There were nights when he lay awake, wondering if he was doing enough, if he was truly honoring his mother's memory, or just easing his own conscience. The pressure came to a head about 3 months after his fateful encounter with Margaret, a major client, unhappy with what they perceived as a lack of personal attention from Jonathan, threatened to take their business elsewhere. At the same time, Margaret had a health scare that required her to be hospitalized for several days. Torn between his professional obligations and his promise to be there for Margaret, Jonathan faced a crucial decision. It was a moment that would define not just his career, but the kind of man he was choosing to become. As he stood in the hospital corridor, his phone buzzing incessantly with messages from the office, Jonathan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought of his mother, of the lessons she had taught him, of the woman she had believed he could be. Opening his eyes, he made his choice. He called his VP of operations and delegated the client meeting to her, knowing she was more than capable of handling it. Then he turned off his phone and walked into Margaret's hospital room, prepared to stay as long as she needed him. It was a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, both positive and negative. But as Jonathan sat by Margaret's bedside, holding her hand and listening to her soft breathing, he knew in his heart that it was the right choice. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more difficult decisions to make. But Jonathan was beginning to understand that true success wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives he touched and the legacy he built. As he looked out the hospital window at the city skyline, Jonathan felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever consequences lay ahead, he was ready to face them, guided by the values his mother had instilled in him and the wisdom Margaret was helping him rediscover. As Jonathan grappled with the changes in his life and the consequences of his decisions, a secondary plot began to unfold, centered around his daughter, Emily. At 16, Emily had been struggling with her own issues. The divorce of her parents had hit her hard, and she had retreated into a world of social media and superficial friendships. Her relationship with Jonathan had become strained, marked by tense silences and occasional outbursts. But Jonathan's transformation and the introduction of Margaret into their lives had sparked something in Emily. At first, she had been skeptical, even resentful of the time her father was spending with this elderly woman. However, curiosity eventually got the better of her, and she agreed to meet Margaret. That first meeting was awkward, with Emily sullen and monosyllabic. But as Margaret began to share stories about Elizabeth, Emily found herself drawn in. Here was a connection to the grandmother she had barely known, a window into a past she had never fully understood. As the weeks passed, Emily began to spend more time with Margaret, often without Jonathan present. She would visit after school, helping Margaret with small tasks around her apartment or simply sitting and listening to her stories. Margaret, in turn, took a genuine interest in Emily's life, offering the kind of non-judgmental ear that teenagers often crave. Through these interactions, Emily began to see her father in a new light. The stories Margaret told of Elizabeth often included Jonathan as a child, his dreams, his struggles, his triumphs. Emily started to understand that her father was more than just the workaholic she had known. He was a complex individual with a history and depth she had never appreciated before. This newfound understanding led to changes in Emily's behavior. She began to open up more to Jonathan, sharing details of her day or asking for his advice on school projects. The tension between them eased, replaced by a tentative warmth. But Emily's transformation wasn't limited to her relationship with her father. Inspired by Margaret's stories of Elizabeth's teaching career and the impact she had on her students, Emily began to reconsider her own future. She had always assumed she would follow in her father's footsteps, pursuing a career in finance. Now, she found herself drawn to the idea of teaching. This shift in Emily's interests led to some conflict. When she announced at dinner one night that she was thinking of majoring in education instead of business, Jonathan's initial reaction was one of surprise and concern. He worried about the financial stability of a teaching career and the opportunities Emily might be giving up. But as he watched his daughter's eyes light up while she talked about working with children and making a difference in their lives, Jonathan realized that she was embodying the very values he was trying to reconnect with. His eventual support of her decision marked a significant turning point in their relationship. Emily's journey also had an impact on her mother, Sarah. Seeing the positive changes in her daughter, Sarah began to soften her stance towards Jonathan. She started to see that his new approach to life wasn't just a phase, but a genuine transformation that was benefiting their child. As Emily became more involved in Margaret's life and more interested in her grandmother's legacy, she came up with an idea that would have far-reaching effects. She proposed creating a documentary about Elizabeth's life and her impact on the community, interviewing Margaret and other former colleagues and students. This project not only gave Emily a sense of purpose, but also served to bring the family closer together. Jonathan found himself sharing memories he had long suppressed. Sarah contributed old photos and letters she had kept, and Margaret's network of former teachers and students expanded the scope of the project beyond what any of them had initially imagined. The secondary plot of Emily's growth and the family's gradual healing added depth to the main story, highlighting the ripple effects of Jonathan's initial act of kindness and his subsequent decisions. It showed that the impact of compassion and connection could extend far beyond the immediate participants, touching lives in unexpected and profound ways. As the months passed, the relationships between Jonathan, Margaret, Emily, and Sarah continued to evolve in complex and often surprising ways. Jonathan and Margaret's relationship deepened beyond their initial connection through Elizabeth. Margaret became not just a link to his mother's past, but a valued friend and mentor in her own right. Their weekly dinners became a fixture in Jonathan's life, a time when he could shed the pressures of his corporate persona and simply be himself. During these dinners, Margaret often challenged Jonathan's perspectives, drawing on her years of experience and her deep-rooted values. She wasn't afraid to call him out when she felt he was falling back into old patterns of prioritizing work over family or personal growth. One evening, after Jonathan had canceled plans with Emily due to a last-minute work emergency, Margaret fixed him with a stern look. "Jonathan," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "your mother always said that at the end of our lives, we won't wish we'd spent more time at the office. We'll wish we'd spent more time with the people we love." These words hit Jonathan hard, prompting him to reassess his priorities once again. He began to make a concerted effort to be more present in Emily's life, even when work pressures mounted. The relationship between Jonathan and Emily flourished as a result. Their weekend outings, once awkward affairs filled with stilted conversation, became something they both looked forward to. Jonathan found himself learning about his daughter's world, her favorite music, her dreams for the future, her fears and insecurities. In turn, Emily began to see her father as a person, not just a distant authority figure. One Saturday, as they walked through Central Park after visiting a museum, Emily suddenly stopped and hugged Jonathan tightly. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, "for everything." Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes as he hugged her back, realizing how close he had come to losing this precious connection. Margaret and Emily's relationship also continued to grow. Emily found in Margaret a confidant and a source of wisdom that was different from what she got from her parents. Margaret's stories about Elizabeth and her teaching career inspired Emily, fueling her growing interest in education. As Emily worked on her documentary project about Elizabeth, she and Margaret spent countless hours going through old photos and letters. These sessions often turned into impromptu life lessons, with Margaret sharing insights on everything from dealing with difficult people to finding one's passion in life. "Your grandmother always said that true fulfillment comes from serving others," Margaret told Emily one afternoon as they sorted through a box of Elizabeth's old teaching awards. She believed that every child she taught was a chance to make the world a little bit better. These words stayed with Emily, shaping her thoughts about her future and her place in the world. Perhaps the most complex relationship development was between Jonathan and his ex-wife Sarah. As they witnessed the positive changes in Emily and saw the impact of Margaret's presence in their lives, they found themselves on new footing with each other. The bitterness and resentment that had characterized their interactions since the divorce began to fade, replaced by a tentative friendliness. They started to approach co-parenting as a team rather than adversaries. One day, after a parent-teacher conference for Emily, Sarah turned to Jonathan with a small smile. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm proud of you, John. The way you've changed, the father you've become, it's really something." Jonathan felt a wave of emotion wash over him at her words. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'm trying to be the man I should have been all along." As these relationships developed and intertwined, they created a support network that strengthened each individual. Jonathan found himself better able to balance his work and personal life, drawing strength from his connections with Margaret, Emily, and even Sarah. Emily blossomed, her improved relationships with both parents providing a stable foundation for her to explore her interests and ambitions. Margaret, who had been lonely and struggling before reconnecting with Jonathan, found new purpose and joy in her role as family friend and mentor. Even Sarah, who had initially been skeptical of the changes in her ex-husband, found that the improved family dynamic reduced her stress and allowed her to focus more on her own personal growth. The development of these relationships wasn't always smooth. There were misunderstandings, old hurts that resurfaced, and new challenges to navigate. But the foundation of compassion, understanding, and shared history that was being built provided a strong base for working through these difficulties. As the documentary project progressed, and the family spent more time together, including Margaret in their gatherings, a new kind of family unit began to emerge. It wasn't traditional, but it was bound by love, respect, and a shared commitment to honoring Elizabeth's legacy. This evolving network of relationships set the stage for the climactic events to come, providing a strong support system that would be tested in unexpected ways. The climactic event of the story unfolded on a crisp autumn evening, almost a year after Jonathan's fateful encounter with Margaret. The family, including Sarah and Margaret, had gathered at Jonathan's penthouse for the premiere screening of Emily's documentary about Elizabeth. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and emotion. Emily, nervous but proud, stood before the assembled group, including a few of Elizabeth's former colleagues who had participated in the project. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice slightly shaky. "This documentary is not just about my grandmother, but about the power of education and the impact one person can have on countless lives." As the film began to play, Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat. Seeing his mother's face on the screen, hearing her voice in old recordings, brought back a flood of memories. He glanced around the room, noting the tears in Margaret's eyes, the rapt attention on Emily's face, and the softness in Sarah's expression. The documentary beautifully captured Elizabeth's spirit, her dedication to her students, and the lasting impact she had on her community. It interwove interviews with former students, now successful adults, who spoke about how Mrs. Blackwell had changed their lives. Margaret's stories provided a personal touch, painting a picture of Elizabeth as not just a teacher, but a friend and confidant. As the film progressed, it became clear that Emily had done more than just tell her grandmother's story. She had drawn parallels between Elizabeth's life and the recent changes in her own family. The documentary touched on themes of redemption, the importance of human connection, and the ripple effects of small acts of kindness. Towards the end of the film, Emily had included a section about Jonathan's transformation over the past year, linking it back to the values Elizabeth had instilled in him. Jonathan watched, stunned, as his own journey was portrayed on screen, complete with interviews from colleagues and employees about the positive changes they'd seen in him and the company. As the credits rolled, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The applause was thunderous, with Margaret leading the standing ovation. Emily beamed, accepting hugs and congratulations from everyone. It was in this moment of joy and pride that the evening took an unexpected turn. Margaret, overwhelmed by emotion, suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed. The room erupted in panic as Jonathan rushed to her side, calling for someone to dial 911. The next few hours were a blur of ambulance sirens, hospital corridors, and anxious waiting. The family huddled together in the waiting room, all previous tensions forgotten in the face of this crisis. Emily clung to Jonathan, her earlier triumph now overshadowed by fear for Margaret. Sarah provided silent support, her hand on Jonathan's shoulder, a comforting presence. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was grave. "Miss Holbrook has suffered a severe heart attack," he explained. "We've stabilized her, but the next 24 hours will be critical. She's asking to see you, Mr. Blackwell." Jonathan entered the hospital room, his heart heavy. Margaret lay in the bed, looking small and frail, a stark contrast to her usual vibrant self. As he approached, she opened her eyes and managed a weak smile. "Jonathan," she whispered, "I need you to promise me something." He leaned in close, taking her hand in his. "Anything, Aunt Maggie. Promise me you'll continue on this path you've started. Promise me you'll keep Elizabeth's legacy alive, not just through words, but through actions." Tears streamed down Jonathan's face as he nodded. "I promise, Aunt Maggie. I promise." As Margaret drifted off to sleep, Jonathan felt the weight of this promise settle on his shoulders. He realized that this moment, this climactic event, was not just a crisis to be weathered, but a call to action. It was a culmination of everything that had happened over the past year, and a pivotal point that would define the path forward. Standing there, holding Margaret's hand and listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, Jonathan knew that whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. The documentary, Margaret's collapse, and the promise he had just made, all of these elements converged to create a moment of profound clarity. As he left the hospital room, Jonathan found his family waiting anxiously. Emily's eyes were red from crying, and Sarah looked pale with worry. Even a few of Jonathan's colleagues who had attended the documentary screening were there, concern etched on their faces. "How is she?" Emily asked, her voice small and frightened. Jonathan took a deep breath. "She's resting now. The doctors say the next 24 hours are critical." He paused, looking at each face in turn. "But there's something we need to do." Over the next hour, in the quiet corner of the hospital waiting room, Jonathan laid out a plan. It was ambitious, perhaps even radical, but as he spoke, he could see the spark of understanding and approval in the eyes of his family and colleagues. "Mom always believed that education was the key to changing lives," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And Margaret? Margaret showed us that it's never too late to make a difference. We have an opportunity here, a responsibility to carry on their legacy in a meaningful way." His plan was to establish the Elizabeth Blackwell Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing educational opportunities for underprivileged students and support for elderly individuals in need. The foundation would work in partnership with Blackwell Investments, leveraging the company's resources and network to create real, lasting change in the community. "It's not enough to just write checks," Jonathan explained. "We need to be actively involved, to use our skills and influence to make a difference. This isn't just about honoring Mom and Margaret. It's about becoming the people they always believed we could be." As Jonathan spoke, he could see the impact of his words. Emily's eyes shone with excitement at the prospect of being involved in such meaningful work. Sarah nodded approvingly, a new respect evident in her gaze. His colleagues, initially skeptical, began to see the potential for positive PR and employee engagement. But it was the reaction of one person that truly cemented the moment as climactic. An elderly gentleman, who had been quietly listening from a nearby chair, stood up with tears in his eyes. "I was one of Elizabeth Blackwell's students many years ago," he said, his voice quavering with emotion. "She changed my life. If there's anything I can do to help with this foundation, anything at all, I'm in." One by one, others in the waiting room, nurses, other patients' family members, even the janitor who had been mopping nearby, began to offer their support. It was as if Margaret's collapse had not just affected Jonathan's family, but had created a ripple effect of compassion and community spirit. As the impromptu planning session continued into the night, with ideas flowing and connections being made, Jonathan felt a profound sense of purpose wash over him. This was more than just a crisis response or a charitable endeavor. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him and his family, but for the entire community. The climactic event, Margaret's health crisis, and the subsequent birth of the foundation idea had crystallized everything Jonathan had learned over the past year. It had brought together all the threads of his journey: his rediscovery of his mother's values, his reconnection with his family, and his reevaluation of what truly mattered in life. As dawn broke, casting a soft light through the hospital windows, Jonathan realized that this climactic moment was not an ending, but a beginning. The real work, the real challenge, lay ahead. But for the first time in years, he felt truly ready to face whatever came next. In the days following Margaret's heart attack and the spontaneous birth of the Elizabeth Blackwell Foundation, Jonathan found himself navigating a complex web of challenges as he attempted to bring his vision to life while balancing the needs of his family, his company, and his own personal growth. The first hurdle came in the form of resistance from some members of the Blackwell Investments Board. While many were supportive of the foundation idea, seeing it as a positive step for the company's image and corporate social responsibility, others were concerned about the potential drain on resources and Jonathan's ability to focus on the core business. "This is all very admirable, Jonathan," said Harold Winters, one of the oldest and most influential board members, during an emergency meeting. "But we're not a charity. Our primary responsibility is to our shareholders." Jonathan had anticipated this resistance and came prepared. He presented a comprehensive plan showing how the foundation could actually benefit the company in the long run through improved employee morale, positive PR, and potential tax benefits. He also proposed a structure that would allow him to dedicate time to the foundation without neglecting his CEO duties. "This isn't just about doing good," Jonathan argued passionately. "It's about doing good business. In today's world, companies that show genuine commitment to social responsibility outperform those that don't." After hours of debate and negotiation, Jonathan managed to secure tentative approval from the board, with the condition that the foundation's activities would be closely monitored and evaluated after 6 months. With the corporate hurdle cleared, Jonathan turned his attention to the practical aspects of setting up the foundation. This is where he faced his next major challenge: his own lack of experience in the nonprofit sector. Recognizing his limitations, Jonathan reached out to experts in the field, including some of his mother's former colleagues in education and social work. One of these experts, Dr. Amelia Rodriguez, a renowned professor of social policy, didn't pull any punches in her assessment. "Your heart's in the right place, Mr. Blackwell," she said during a consultation, "but good intentions aren't enough. You need a solid understanding of the systemic issues you're trying to address." This criticism stung, but Jonathan recognized its truth. He threw himself into research, attending seminars, reading extensively, and even enrolling in a short course on nonprofit management. The learning curve was steep, and there were moments when he felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the issues he was trying to tackle. Meanwhile, Jonathan was also grappling with personal challenges. Margaret's recovery was slow, and her extended hospital stay meant that she couldn't be as involved in the foundation's early stages as they had hoped. Emily, excited about the foundation, was also struggling to balance her involvement with her schoolwork and college applications. Sarah, while supportive, expressed concerns about the impact of Jonathan's new commitments on his ability to co-parent effectively. "I'm proud of what you're doing, John," she said during a tense conversation, "but Emily needs her father, not just a figurehead for a foundation." These words hit Jonathan hard, forcing him to confront the possibility that in his enthusiasm for the foundation, he might be neglecting other important aspects of his life. He realized that true conflict resolution wasn't just about addressing external challenges, but also about finding balance and harmony in all areas of his life. In an attempt to address these various conflicts, Jonathan decided to take a two-pronged approach. First, he would create a strong organizational structure for the foundation, delegating responsibilities to capable individuals rather than trying to manage everything himself. This would allow the foundation to function effectively while giving him more flexibility to attend to his other commitments. Secondly, he would make a conscious effort to integrate his family into the foundation's work in meaningful ways. He invited Emily to join the Youth Advisory Board, giving her a real voice in shaping the foundation's educational initiatives. He also reached out to Sarah, valuing her input on programs aimed at supporting single parents and children of divorce. As for Margaret, Jonathan arranged for foundation meetings to be held in her hospital room when possible, ensuring that she remained connected and involved during her recovery. These visits had the added benefit of lifting Margaret's spirits and, according to her doctors, potentially aiding in her recovery. Despite these efforts, the path to resolution was not smooth. There were setbacks and moments of doubt. A promising partnership with a local school district fell through due to bureaucratic red tape. An early fundraising event underperformed, raising questions about the foundation's viability. There were personal setbacks, too. Jonathan missed one of Emily's school events due to a foundation emergency, leading to a heated argument with both Emily and Sarah. The stress began to take a toll on his health, with his doctor warning him about his elevated blood pressure and lack of sleep. Yet, through it all, Jonathan persevered. He learned from each setback, adjusted his approach, and kept pushing forward. He began to see conflict not as something to be avoided, but as an opportunity for growth and improvement. Slowly but surely, progress was made. The foundation launched its first scholarship program, sending 10 underprivileged students to college with full funding. A mentorship initiative pairing retirees with at-risk youth showed promising early results. Blackwell Investments saw an uptick in employee satisfaction and a surge of positive media coverage. As the 6-month review approached, Jonathan felt a mix of anxiety and pride. He knew there was still much work to be done, many conflicts still to be resolved. But he also knew that he had already accomplished something significant. Not just in terms of the foundation's early successes, but in his own personal growth and the strengthening of his family bonds. The true resolution of the conflicts he faced, both external and internal, was still a work in progress. But Jonathan was beginning to understand that perhaps the journey itself, the constant striving for balance and positive impact, was just as important as any final resolution. As he prepared for the board review, Jonathan reflected on how far he had come since that cold day when he gave his coat to a shivering Margaret. The conflicts he now faced were, in many ways, a result of the positive changes in his life, and for that he was grateful. The 6-month review of the Elizabeth Blackwell Foundation marked a significant turning point for Jonathan and the trajectory of his life's work. As he stood before the Blackwell Investments Board, Jonathan felt a sense of déjà vu, remembering the tense meeting months ago when he had first proposed the foundation. But this time, he stood taller, more confident, armed with not just ideas, but concrete results. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Jonathan began, his voice steady, "6 months ago, we embarked on a journey that many of you viewed with skepticism. Today, I'm here to show you that our investment in the community is not just morally right, but financially sound." Over the next hour, Jonathan presented a compelling case for the foundation's success. He showed statistics demonstrating improved employee retention and job satisfaction at Blackwell Investments since the foundation's inception. He shared glowing media coverage that had boosted the company's public image. Most importantly, he presented testimonials from individuals whose lives had been changed by the foundation's programs. As Jonathan concluded his presentation, the room fell silent. He held his breath, waiting for the board's reaction. It was Harold Winters, once his strongest critic, who spoke first. "Jonathan," Harold said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I'll be the first to admit I was wrong. What you've accomplished here, it's remarkable. Your mother would be proud." The board's approval was unanimous. Not only would the foundation continue, but they voted to increase its funding and expand its programs. This decision marked a new direction not just for Jonathan, but for Blackwell Investments as a whole. Energized by this success, Jonathan realized it was time to take the next step. In a move that surprised many, he announced his intention to step down as CEO of Blackwell Investments to focus full-time on the foundation. "I'm not leaving the company," he explained to the shocked board members. "I'm expanding our mission. Blackwell Investments will always be a part of me, but I believe I can do more good for our company and our community by dedicating myself to the foundation." This decision sent ripples through the business world. Some praised Jonathan's commitment to social responsibility, while others questioned the wisdom of leaving a lucrative CEO position. But for Jonathan, the path forward was clear. As he left the boardroom that day, Jonathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer torn between two worlds: the cutthroat realm of high finance and the compassionate mission of the foundation. He had found a way to align his work with his values, to honor his mother's legacy while forging his own path. This turning point represented more than just a career change. It was the culmination of a personal transformation that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a cold winter day. Jonathan was stepping into a new chapter of his life, one filled with purpose, connection, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. As he headed home to share the news with Emily and Sarah, and to visit Margaret in her recovery facility, Jonathan felt a sense of excitement and possibility that he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but he was ready to face them, armed with the lessons he had learned and the support of the family he had rediscovered. In the months following his decision to focus full-time on the Elizabeth Blackwell Foundation, Jonathan found himself in a period of profound reflection and personal growth. The man who had once measured his worth solely by his corporate success and financial achievements was learning to value a different kind of richness. One crisp autumn morning, almost 2 years after his fateful encounter with Margaret, Jonathan sat on a bench in Central Park, the same park where he had first given his coat to a shivering stranger. As he watched the early morning joggers and dog walkers, he marveled at how much his perspective had changed. He thought back to the man he had been, driven, successful, but ultimately unfulfilled. The Jonathan of 2 years ago would have scoffed at the idea of leaving a high-powered CEO position to run a nonprofit. Yet here he was, and he had never felt more alive or purposeful. The growth hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, nights when he questioned his decisions, days when the challenges of running the foundation seemed overwhelming. But with each obstacle overcome, each life touched by the foundation's work, Jonathan felt his resolve strengthen. He had learned patience, a virtue that had never been his strong suit in the corporate world. Working with underprivileged students and elderly individuals taught him the value of listening, of understanding that change often comes slowly but meaningfully. His relationship with Emily had blossomed in ways he could never have imagined. Her involvement in the foundation had given them a common purpose, a shared passion that bridged the gap years of emotional distance had created. He smiled, remembering the pride in Emily's eyes when the foundation's first batch of scholarship recipients graduated from college. Even his relationship with Sarah had evolved. While they hadn't rekindled their romantic relationship, they had found a new respect and friendship in their shared commitment to co-parenting and their support of the foundation's work. The bitterness of their divorce had faded, replaced by a warm camaraderie that Jonathan cherished. Margaret's influence continued to be a guiding force in Jonathan's life. Though her health remained fragile, her spirit was as strong as ever. Their weekly dinners had become a time of reflection and planning, with Margaret offering wisdom gained from a lifetime of teaching and community service. As Jonathan sat on the bench, he pulled out a small, worn photo from his wallet. It showed his mother, Elizabeth, standing in front of her first classroom, a bright smile on her face. He ran his thumb over the image, feeling a connection to her that had been lost for so many years. "I hope I'm making you proud, Mom," he whispered. A voice from behind startled him. "I'm sure she is, Dad." Jonathan turned to see Emily standing there, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She sat down next to him, handing him one of the cups. "I thought I might find you here," she said with a smile. "Remembering where it all began?" Jonathan nodded, putting his arm around his daughter, just reflecting on how much has changed, how much I've changed. Emily leaned into him. "You know, Dad, when I was little, I used to think you were some kind of superhero. Always busy, always important. But now I know you're something even better. You're human. You're real." Her words touched Jonathan deeply. He had spent so much of his life trying to be invincible, unassailable. Now he understood that true strength came from vulnerability, from connection, from the willingness to learn and grow. As they sat there, father and daughter, watching the park come to life around them, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had grown in ways he never thought possible, rediscovering parts of himself he thought were long lost. The journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more ways to grow, more lives to touch. But Jonathan knew now that he was on the right path. A path that honored his mother's legacy, that nurtured his relationships, and that allowed him to make a real difference in the world. As the morning sun warmed their faces, Jonathan silently renewed his commitment to this new life he had built. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, not as the isolated, driven CEO he once was, but as a man surrounded by love, guided by compassion, and dedicated to making a difference. Emily's voice broke into his thoughts. "You know, Dad, I've been thinking about my future a lot lately." Jonathan turned to her, curious. "Oh, what's on your mind, sweetheart?" I think I want to become a teacher," Emily said, a mix of excitement and nervousness in her voice. "Working with the foundation, seeing the impact education can have, it's made me realize that's where my passion lies." Jonathan felt a surge of emotion. His daughter, following in his mother's footsteps, carrying on Elizabeth's legacy in the most direct way possible. He pulled Emily into a tight hug, blinking back tears. "Your grandmother would be so proud," he whispered. "And so am I." As they sat there, discussing Emily's plans for the future, Jonathan reflected on how much they had both grown. Emily had transformed from a sullen teenager into a compassionate young woman with a clear sense of purpose. And he had evolved from a distant, work-obsessed father into someone who could truly be present for his daughter, supporting her dreams and sharing in her journey. Later that day, as Jonathan visited Margaret in her assisted living facility, he shared Emily's news. Margaret's face lit up with joy. "Oh, Jonathan," she said, clasping his hand, "do you see now? Do you see how one small act of kindness can set off a chain reaction that changes so many lives?" Jonathan nodded, the full weight of her words sinking in. That cold day when he'd given his coat to a shivering stranger had been the first domino in a series of events that had not only transformed his life, but was now shaping the future of the next generation. As he left Margaret's room, Jonathan paused in the hallway, overwhelmed by a sense of gratitude. He was grateful for Margaret, for the second chance she had given him to connect with his mother's legacy. He was grateful for Emily, for her forgiveness and for the way she had embraced this new chapter in their lives. He was even grateful for the struggles and challenges he had faced, for they had shaped him into the man he was today. Jonathan realized that his growth wasn't just about becoming a better person or a more effective leader. It was about becoming more fully himself, the self his mother had always seen in him, the self that had been buried under years of corporate ambition and emotional detachment. As he walked out of the facility into the warm afternoon sun, Jonathan felt a sense of peace and purpose that he had never known in his years as a high-powered CEO. He had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives touched, the relationships nurtured, and the positive change created in the world. The journey of growth and self-discovery was far from over. There would be new challenges to face, new lessons to learn. But Jonathan was no longer of change or uncertainty. He had found his true calling, reconnected with his family, and honored his mother's legacy in ways he never thought possible. As he headed home, eager to continue his discussion with Emily about her future plans, Jonathan smiled to himself. Life had come full circle, and he couldn't wait to see where the next chapter would lead. As the sun set on another busy day at the Elizabeth Blackwell Foundation, Jonathan stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city he was working to improve. The room was filled with photos and mementos, his mother's teaching awards, pictures of scholarship recipients, news clippings about the foundation's successes. Each item told a story of lives changed and hope restored. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. It was Emily, fresh from her first day of student teaching. Her eyes were bright with excitement as she recounted her experiences, the challenges and joys of working with young minds. As Jonathan listened to his daughter, he was struck by the beautiful symmetry of their journey. What had begun with a simple act of kindness, giving a coat to a shivering stranger, had blossomed into a legacy of compassion and service that would outlive him. The themes that had defined his transformation over the past 2 years resonated strongly in this moment. The power of small acts of kindness to create ripple effects of positive change. The importance of honoring one's roots while forging a new path. The true meaning of wealth and success, measured not in dollars, but in lives touched and communities strengthened. As Emily finished her story, Jonathan pulled her into a warm embrace. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," he said softly. "Of both of us." In that moment, Jonathan felt the presence of all those who had shaped his journey. His mother, Margaret, even his younger, more driven self. He realized that true fulfillment came not from personal achievement, but from being part of something larger than oneself, from creating a legacy of love and service that would continue long after he was gone. As father and daughter left the office together, discussing plans for the Foundation's next initiative, Jonathan knew that while his story had come full circle, it was far from over. The lessons he had learned, the growth he had experienced, were not an endpoint, but a beginning. Every day brought new opportunities to make a difference, to show kindness, to live the values that had become the cornerstone of his life. The coat he had given away on that cold winter day had not only warmed a stranger, it had set him on a path to rediscovering his own humanity, and in doing so, Jonathan had found a warmth and richness in life that no amount of money could ever buy.